In this example, I want to go ahead and take a look at what the difference is in API Gateway between a resource and a method. So I've set up a Dynamo filter example. I believe that's the example that I just was looking at. This one right here. And the way the Dynamo filter works is if I look at the code, we're running a begins with filter expression to say where the team ID begins with, and then that's passing from the event argument, and we're looking for a team ID. And if I look at the test case that we have, the team ID is configured so that I'm looking for all the player records. So if I go ahead and test this, you'll see that there's 10 player records. Okay, so Shohei, Mike Trout, Albert Pujols, Cole Calhoun, Jackson Churio, Manny Machado. So those are the player records. If I were to change the test, so instead of player info, I look for team info and save it and test again. Then I'm going to get team records. And it looks like there's 9 team records. Okay, so it's basically just running a filter expression on a scan command, and it's getting either teams or players or games depending on what that filter expression is. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm just going to hard code this team ID. So instead of getting it from the event argument, I'm going to go ahead and hard code this as player info underscore. I don't really need the underscore, but player info underscore. I'm going to go ahead and hard code that, and I'm going to deploy it. And I can test it still. Okay, and then the output will show up here down in the output window. So it's showing me that I scanned 25 records, and if I scroll up, you'll eventually see that I have the player records. It's kind of hard to scroll within the two windows, but there's 10 player records. Okay, so what I want to do is over here in the API Gateway resources, what I want to do is up until this point we've kind of been limited to say we can go ahead and if we go to the resources section and we're looking at the root of our API, we can create a method and then it'll ask us what our methods are. And we're starting to run out of methods. But what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and back up a little bit. And instead what I want to do is I actually want to create a resource underneath this root URL. So I'm going to go ahead and create a resource, and I'm going to call it my players resource. Okay, so now it's a different URL. So it was the same URL as the API, but now I have players appended as a suffix at the end of that URL. Okay, and there's no way to access this players URL at this point because I don't have any methods associated with it. So now that I've selected players, I can create a method that's specific to players. So in this case, I want to read all the player records. So I can do an HTTP GET. I'm going to have a Lambda function that I'm integrating it with, and it's going to be my filter. Right, because we've hard-coded it as players. And then I'm going to go ahead and create that method. So now I have that get underneath the players. And if I deploy this API, it should be somewhat working, right? So I go ahead and deploy the API. I deploy it to my baseball stats. So if I'm looking at it, this first get will be just to the baseball stats URL. But if I look at the players get, then you'll notice that players is appended to the end as a suffix. Okay, and I should be able to go out to a browser window and see those player records. Right, and I have some of the metadata because I didn't map over the records and each item and then unmarshal the records. So I didn't do that mapping. But if I wanted to do that, I have an object that has items, and I can loop through all the items and unmarshal them, and that would get returned. Right? So if I go over to my code, I should be able to unmarshal all the items. And then I should be able to return those unmarshaled items. Okay, and then there we go. I don't need to unmarshal an individual item. And if I deploy that, okay, so now I've made the change to my function definition. Now I should just see the items, if I've done this correctly. And those are just the player records without the metadata. Okay, so I have players. I could also do the same thing. If I go back over to my API, I can go to resources. Right now I have the players. One thing I will note is that I'm accessing the players through the URL. If I were to take that over to my client application, so I have some JavaScript code here, right? In my JavaScript code, I was accessing the API. If I were to instead access the players URL, okay, so that's in index.html and index.js. If I go to that URL, I'm localhost, so I have localhost 5500 and then index.html. So I go to that application and I do an inspect and I look at my console. You'll notice that I'm getting an error and I'm getting a CORS error again. And the idea here is that I'm getting a CORS error because at the root level I've enabled CORS for the get, post, and options, but at the players level I did not enable CORS. So if I go to players, I have to enable CORS at the players level. I'm going to allow the get and save that. And now you'll notice that there's an options underneath players. I can redeploy my API. And now that I've redeployed my API with CORS enabled at the players level, now my client application should now be working. Okay, so now you'll notice that I have the 10 players. I can also go further. So in my API, right now I have the root level kind of interacting with it. I can create another resource called games. Right? And right now I don't have any methods underneath games. I could create another resource for teams. Right? And I don't have any methods under teams either. And the idea is that I could have get, post, put, delete, options, all of those different HTTP verbs under each of those different endpoints. So right now I kind of have a cluster of a mess here because the get is all records, the post is to insert any type of record, when in reality I may just want endpoints that are specific to the games or the players or the teams, depending on which operation I'm doing. Okay, I don't have to do that, but that's one way I could build out the API. And I can have different endpoints for the different object types that I have in my data set. I don't have to, right? So this is all about API design, but I do have the option of creating resources which would basically set up different endpoints within my API. So if you were thinking like an educational environment, you might think students and teachers and courses and semesters and degrees and things like that. So you might have different resources for all of those different objects. If I was thinking of an auto dealer, I might have vehicles and customers and incentives and things like that, right? So I might have different endpoints depending on which type of API I'm trying to create. I probably am not going to just have a single endpoint for all the different object types, kind of the way we initially started with this API. Instead, I'm going to have different resources for the different object types that I have as part of my data set. So this is just an introduction into creating resources inside of API Gateway.